On August 4, 1981, a father made a horrifying discovery when he visited his daughter's home in Cherry Hills Village, Colorado. Sylvia Mae Quayle was found dead on her living room floor, the victim of a sexual assault, multiple stab wounds, and a single gunshot to the back of her head. Law enforcement responded, gathered evidence, and interviewed people in the surrounding area, but the killer was never identified. Biological samples from the scene were eventually submitted to the FBI's national database, where they sat unanswered for years. The investigation went nowhere, until a revolutionary new technology and a discarded soda can in Nebraska changed everything. Sylvia had grown up in the southern Denver suburbs, graduating from Englewood High School before going on to work as a secretary at an architecture firm. It was a role that reflected her genuine passion for history and design, interest she had developed partly through her uncle Wesley, a practicing architect whose work she studied with deep admiration. Those who knew her remembered her as energetic, warm, and full of life, the kind of person who transformed any room she walked into. She lived independently in a house on South Ogden Street, a peaceful and well-to-do neighborhood roughly 7 miles from downtown Denver. The day of her murder began without any sign of what was to come. The neighborhood was calm, the weather unremarkable, and nobody nearby noticed anything out of the ordinary. Inside her home, however, Sylvia became the target of an attack that was neither panicked nor random. It was deliberate and brutal. After the assault, her killer left without being seen or heard. It was her father who eventually discovered her, after repeated knocking went unanswered. He entered the home and found his daughter on the floor, unclothed and posed with both arms raised above her head. He immediately contacted police. In the days that followed, investigators partnered with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation to broaden the scope of the inquiry. The crime scene was carefully documented, physical evidence was secured, and DNA samples were collected from Sylvia's body and various points throughout the house. That biological material represented the clearest link to the perpetrator. But in 1981, DNA profiling as it exists today was not yet available. Without a modern database or matching technology, even the most compelling physical evidence was useless unless investigators already had a name to compare it to. Detectives questioned numerous men in the area, pursued leads that surfaced in the early weeks of the investigation, and examined anyone who seemed suspicious or lacked a solid alibi. Every avenue was explored and every avenue closed without result. There were no eyewitnesses, no matching fingerprints, and ultimately no one who could be charged. As months turned into years, the case gradually slipped into dormancy. Detectives rotated off the file, retired, or moved on to other work, and Sylvia's case became what investigators call a cold case. By the year 2000, nearly 2 decades after her murder, CBI submitted the original crime scene DNA to CODIS, the FBI's national database of convicted offenders. The system searched and came back empty. Whoever had killed Sylvia had either never been convicted of an offense requiring DNA submission or had committed his crimes before such laws were enacted. The file remained in a drawer, and the killer remained free. Through all those years, Sylvia's sister Jo Hammett refused to let the case die. She called detectives regularly, showed up at press conferences whenever authorities revisited the file, and made sure her sister's name was never quietly erased. On Sylvia's gravestone, the family had chosen the inscription "Beauty Seen is Never Lost," a tribute to the woman she had been before that August morning, and a quiet, painful reminder that her life had been taken by someone who continued to walk free. 40 years is a long time to carry unanswered questions. Long enough to watch others move on. Long enough for people to gently suggest that acceptance might be the only remaining option. Jo never accepted that. She understood the reality of cold cases. She knew many were never solved. But surrendering, to her, would have meant giving her sister's killer a victory he had not earned. She kept waiting for signs to close the gap. That gap began to close in 2013, when the District Attorney's Office for Colorado's 18th Judicial District launched a dedicated cold case unit tasked specifically with revisiting files that time and limited technology had left unsolved. No new witnesses had come forward. No new evidence had surfaced. But investigative tools had advanced far enough to look at old evidence in entirely new ways. Sylvia's case was among the very first to land on that unit's desk. Investigators pulled everything from storage, DNA samples, physical evidence, interview records, all of it collected from a crime scene more than 3 decades old. They then partnered with a private firm called United Data Connect, which specializes in a technique known as genetic genealogy, sometimes called genetic family tree identification. This approach works very differently from CODIS. Rather than searching a database of criminal offenders, genetic genealogy involves uploading an unknown DNA profile into public ancestry platforms, where millions of ordinary people have voluntarily shared their own genetic information out of curiosity about their heritage or a desire to connect with relatives. If anyone in those databases shares a biological relationship with the unknown subject, even a distant cousin who has never met the person, the system can detect it. Genealogy specialists then construct a family tree from those connections, following each branch through public records including birth certificates, marriage filings, and death notices, steadily narrowing the field until only a small group of possible suspects remains. When the 1981 crime scene DNA was uploaded into 2 public genealogy databases, something responded for the first time. The initial matches were not definitive. They pointed to distant relatives, partial branches of a family tree still waiting to be fully mapped. The team at United Data Connect spent considerable time building out that tree, cross-referencing documents and public records at every turn, pruning branches, and following leads until one name emerged: David Dwayne Anderson, 62 years old, residing in Nebraska. Further research indicated Anderson had been present at locations in Colorado near the crime scene both before and after August 4, 1981. The pieces were aligning, but genetic genealogy, no matter how precise, does not constitute legal evidence. A family tree can suggest who might be responsible. It cannot prove, in a court of law, who was actually inside that house on South Ogden Street on that summer afternoon in 1981. To build a case strong enough for court, investigators needed something more than a family tree. They needed a direct DNA sample from Anderson himself, obtained without his knowledge or cooperation. A team traveled quietly to his apartment building in Nebraska, made no attempt to contact him, and simply waited. When Anderson discarded his trash, investigators retrieved the bag and searched through it. Inside, they found an empty vanilla Coke can he had just thrown away. The DNA extracted from that can was sent to a laboratory and compared against the biological evidence collected from Sylvia's home and body in 1981. The results confirmed a match across multiple samples. 40 years of freedom ended by a piece of garbage. An arrest warrant was issued without delay. On February 10, 2021, Anderson was taken into custody in Nebraska and extradited to Colorado to face 2 counts of first-degree murder. The news sent a ripple through Cherry Hills Village, not only because the community's longest-standing cold case had finally produced an arrest, but because the man arrested was a complete outsider. Nobody in the neighborhood recognized his name. Nobody had ever connected him to Sylvia or to the area. The answer, when it finally came, arrived from a direction no one had anticipated. When investigators began looking into Anderson's background, they found nothing that stood out. He was not someone who left a strong impression on those around him. He had lived an ordinary, unremarkable life in Nebraska, attracting no particular suspicion from neighbors or associates. What the records did show, however, was that in 1981 he had been present in Colorado, at locations in the vicinity of Cherry Hills Village and the house on South Ogden Street both before and after August 4th. What brought him there was never made entirely clear, but what was clear was that he had no known relationship with Sylvia, no prior history with the community, and no mention anywhere in the original case file. His name had never appeared on any list of suspects compiled during the early investigation. The deputy district attorney who prosecuted the case later described the crime as brutal and random, language that suggested an opportunistic attack driven by no personal motive, no prior acquaintance, simply a man who encountered a house and chose to act on that summer afternoon 4 decades earlier. Anderson was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder and tried under the criminal statutes that were in force in 1981, the year the crime was committed. The first trial opened in March 2022 at Arapahoe County Court. Jurors spent several days hearing the full body of evidence: the DNA chain, the genetic genealogy methodology, the family tree reconstruction, and the story of the vanilla Coke can retrieved from a trash bin in Nebraska. Then they withdrew to deliberate. 5 days later, they returned without a verdict. The jury was completely deadlocked, unable to reach the consensus required either to convict or acquit. The judge declared a mistrial, and the entire process had to begin again. For Sylvia's family, after 40 years of waiting and what felt like the finish line finally in sight, the mistrial was a devastating setback. But the district attorney's office for the 18th Judicial District did not step back. They refiled charges the following month and prepared to present the case to an entirely new jury. The second trial commenced in June 2022. A new panel of jurors heard the same evidence: the DNA comparisons, the genealogy work, the soda can, the decades-long investigation. This time, there was no deadlock. The jury returned a verdict of guilty on both counts of first-degree murder. Speaking outside the courthouse afterward, Deputy District Attorney Grant Grossbauer stated that for more than 40 years, the defendant had carried a dark secret, and that secret had finally been exposed. The sentencing took place on August 4, 2022, exactly 41 years to the day after Sylvia's father had walked into that house on South Ogden Street and made the discovery that would define the rest of his family's life. The date was not accidental. Everyone present in that courtroom understood its significance. David Dwayne Anderson was sentenced to life in prison. Because the case was prosecuted under the laws of 1981, he remained eligible for parole consideration after serving 20 years, the maximum penalty structure permitted under the legislation in effect at the time of the crime. Sylvia's sister Jo Hammett, who had spent decades calling detectives, attending press conferences, and refusing to allow her sister's name to fade from anyone's memory, was present in the courtroom that day. Her words were simple and direct. He needed to pay for what he had done, and on that day, he had. Cherry Hills Village remains much as it always was, tree-lined streets, spacious homes, a quiet and comfortable suburb south of Denver. The house on South Ogden Street still stands. But the woman who once lived there, the secretary who poured her free time into studying architecture and history, who made every room feel warmer simply by entering it, had everything taken from her on a summer afternoon in 1981. The inscription on her gravestone reads, "Beauty seen is never lost." This story is not really about DNA technology or genealogy databases or a discarded soda can, though all of those things matter. At its core, it is a story about people who refuse to let a name disappear. A father who could not forget what he found behind his daughter's door. A sister who kept calling, kept showing up, kept insisting that the case was not closed. Investigators who returned to a file that others had long set aside. Justice arrived 40 years late, but it arrived. Sylvia Mae Quayle was 34 years old, and her name will not be forgotten. The case also leaves behind an important lesson. Never take home security for granted, regardless of how safe or affluent your neighborhood may appear. In 1981, Cherry Hills Village was considered one of the most secure communities in Colorado, yet even the safest-looking neighborhood cannot guarantee absolute protection. The first lesson this case leaves behind is a practical one. Lock your doors, install security cameras, and never open the door to someone you do not know. These are small, simple habits, but they can be the difference between safety and tragedy. The second lesson belongs to anyone who has a loved one whose case remains unsolved. Do not go quiet. Keep calling the detectives assigned to the file. Show up when law enforcement holds press conferences. Ask specifically about newer investigative tools, genetic genealogy in particular, that may not yet have been applied to your family member's case. Jo Hammett's refusal to let go over the course of 40 years was not a footnote in this story. It was one of the central reasons the case survived long enough to be solved. Third, understand that forensic science is evolving at a pace that would have seemed extraordinary even a generation ago. Cases that appear completely hopeless, files that have collected dust for decades, can be brought back to life by technologies that simply did not exist when the crime occurred. If you live in a community where a cold case remains open and you hold even a small piece of information, something that may seem trivial or unconnected, report it to law enforcement. What feels insignificant to you may be precisely the missing piece that investigators need. And finally, remember the names. People like Sylvia Mae Quayle deserve to be remembered not as case numbers or file references, but as the full human beings they were. Public awareness and community attention are a form of pressure. They signal to the justice system that certain cases cannot be quietly shelved and forgotten. If this story moved you, please subscribe so you do not miss the cases still to come. Every person behind every case deserves to have their name spoken. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next one.